I always knew I was the second best child in the family. It wasn't something my parents ever said outright, they didn't have to. Their actions spoke louder than any words. My brother, Mike, was their golden child, their firstborn, their pride and joy. Just 2 years older than me, he could do no wrong in their eyes. I remember one childhood incident. Mike broke Mom's favorite vase while playing baseball right in the living room. I held my breath, expecting an explosion, but Mom just sighed and said with a smile, "Boys will be boys. At least you're practicing. Keep swinging, honey." But when I accidentally spilled orange juice on the carpet a week later, the reaction was entirely different. "Peyton, how could you be so careless?" Mom's voice still echoes in my ears. "Get the cleaning supplies right now. And by the way, you're grounded for the weekend." These double standards were the backdrop of my childhood. When Mike got in trouble at school, my parents made excuses for him. "He's just more focused on sports right now." But if I brought home a good grade instead of an excellent one, they didn't even look up from their phones. "You could do better if you tried harder," Dad muttered once, flipping through his newspaper. The only person who truly saw me was Grandma Liv. She lived just a few blocks away, and her house became my refuge. Of course, she adored Mike too. She baked cookies for him, attended all his games. But unlike my parents, she noticed my achievements as well. "How's school, sweetheart?" she'd ask, pouring me a cup of hot chocolate. "I won the school literature competition," I'd answer, and she would instantly beam with pride. "Of course you did." "You're brilliant," she'd smile, gently patting my hand. This pattern continued for years. Mike's birthdays were grand celebrations, complete with inflatable castles, crowds of friends, and enormous, expertly decorated cakes. My birthdays, well, half the time, my parents simply forgot about them. I remember my 10th birthday vividly. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for someone to say something, anything. But Mom was busy helping Mike with his science project. Dad, as always, hid behind his newspaper. I waited all day, but no one even glanced my way. That evening, when I finally gathered the courage to remind them, Dad looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, right. Happy birthday, kiddo. We'll get you something next time we're at the mall." They never did. Only Grandma remembered. That night, she came over with a small gift and a cupcake with a single candle on top. "Make a wish, my dear," she whispered, covering my hand with her warm, wrinkled one. And in that moment, I felt like I mattered to someone. I learned not to expect anything from my parents. Any bit of recognition, no matter how small, felt like a miracle. I poured my heart into my studies, joined every academic club I could find, trying to carve out an identity of my own beyond Mike's shadow. But at home, I remained invisible. Everything changed the day Grandma got sick. I was 14, Mike was 16. I spent every free moment with her, sitting in the uncomfortable chair by her bed while she napped, doing my homework there. Sometimes, we talked. She loved telling stories about her youth, and I listened, hanging on to every word, memorizing every detail. Mike visited her too. But not as often. "He has practice," my parents explained. "It's important for his future." I stayed silent. I knew that to them, his future would always matter more than mine. One evening, just days before she passed away, Grandma Liv called our whole family into her hospital room. I remember that moment with perfect clarity, the pale glow of the lamps, the muted beeping of hospital monitors, the stark white sheets that made her look even more fragile. Her face, once so full of life, was now gaunt, but her eyes still held the same strength I had known since childhood. Mom, Dad, Mike, and I gathered around her bed. We stood in a tight semicircle, as if bracing for the inevitable, yet refusing to fully acknowledge that it was happening. Grandma took a labored breath, squeezing Dad's hand with her frail fingers. I want you to promise me something. Her voice was quiet but firm. Dad leaned in closer, his face caught between worry and resignation. Of course, Mom, he replied. Promise me that you'll use my inheritance for both of them. Her gaze shifted to me, then to Mike. Peyton and Mike. They both need an education. They must go to college. Dad nodded with a solemnity that felt almost performative, like a priest taking a vow. Of course, Mom, I promise you right here, in front of everyone, that your inheritance will go toward Mike and Peyton's education. I clenched my fists. Deep down, I knew better than to get my hopes up, but his words still sparked something inside me. I knew I'd have to prove my worth as always, but now I had at least some ground to demand fairness. I threw myself even harder into my studies. Yes, Dad had made a promise, but I wasn't willing to take chances. I had to prove that I deserved college on my own merits. My report cards were flawless, straight A's across the board. I left them on the kitchen table, hoping someone would notice. But they always ended up buried under stacks of restaurant menus, junk mail, and Mike's game schedules. The only person who had once proudly displayed my achievements on the fridge was no longer there to do it. I joined the debate club, even though every speech felt like a battle. My voice wavered, my palms sweated. Clear your throat less, Peyton, my coach advised. You have strong arguments, let them hear you. Over time, I learned to speak loudly and with confidence. At home, my voice remained unheard, but at least in the debate room, people listened. I won first place at the science fair with my project on renewable energy. A local newspaper even published an article about me. I carefully placed the clipping on Dad's desk, but a day later, I found it buried under a pile of unread papers. Mike's football schedule, on the other hand, was always on the fridge, neatly marked with red circles. Then came Mike's graduation. Our usually quiet house suddenly turned into the center of a massive celebration. For weeks, Mom planned every detail: decorations, catering, the guest list. We're so proud of you, son, Dad announced, clinking his glass to get everyone's attention. The backyard was packed with guests, relatives, friends, half the neighborhood. Mike sat at the center of it all, grinning, a brand new set of car keys glinting in his hands. I stood in the corner, holding a plate of cake I couldn't bring myself to eat. Thanks to your mother's savings, Dad continued, we were able to secure Mike's future at one of the top colleges in the country. She would have been so proud of him. The guests erupted into applause. And I just stood there, trying to convince myself that I shouldn't be surprised. 2 months later, our whole family drove 6 states away to move Mike into his dorm at Preston University. Mom and Dad helped him unpack, took pictures of every little thing, double-checked lists to make sure he had everything he needed. They even stayed an extra 2 days just to make sure he was settled. After he left, our house became an extension of Preston. My parents called Mike every single day, sometimes putting him on speaker so his voice filled the kitchen during dinner. Have you eaten today? Mom would ask. How's it going with your coach? Dad would add. They visited him every other weekend, coming back with excited stories about his life, his friends, his football victories. He's grown up so much, Mom would say, wiping away a tear. That school was made for him, Dad would agree. No one ever asked about me. Meanwhile, I kept studying through my senior year. In my quiet room, at my desk under the glow of a lamp, I pored over textbooks, took practice tests, mapped out my college application strategy. No one brought me tea. No one asked how I was doing. No one cared about my academic competitions. I was moving toward my future, but I wasn't sure if I'd be allowed to enter it. 2 years passed in a blur, and I graduated at the top of my class. Not that anyone at home noticed. Or, more importantly, cared. On graduation day, I put on a white dress and draped the honor cords over my shoulders, the symbols of everything I had accomplished. But my parents weren't in the audience. They had left 3 days ago. "We need a vacation, sweetheart," Mom said as she packed their suitcases. "So much stress, so many worries. We need to reset. We'll bring you back a souvenir." As if missing my graduation was as insignificant as forgetting about dinner on a Tuesday. I sat among my classmates, watching their parents beam with pride, snapping hundreds of photos, capturing every second of the moment. My friend Jenny's mom took a few pictures of me, too. "Your parents will want to see this," she said with a smile, handing me her phone. I didn't have the heart to tell her that they probably wouldn't even ask. While my classmates celebrated with their families, I went home and started working on my college applications. I had been preparing for this moment for months. Carefully crafted essays, meticulously gathered recommendation letters, neatly organized certificates and diplomas, everything was ready. A week later, the first responses started arriving. Evergreen State University offered me a full scholarship, including free housing in the dorms. Their letter was filled with admiration. They praised my academic achievements, my extracurricular involvement, calling me a promising student. Then came a letter from Blackwood College. Their program was exactly what I had dreamed of. The campus was smaller, but the professors were among the best. This was the place I truly wanted to go. But the tuition was steep. Not as high as Preston University, where Mike was studying, but still significant. I knew my parents had my share of grandma's inheritance. They often discussed financial matters, and I had heard enough to be certain the money was there. So I waited for them to return. The letter from Blackwood sat in my desk drawer, hidden like something sacred. The letter from Evergreen was my backup plan. 2 weeks later, my parents came home, tanned and relaxed. They talked about beaches, exquisite dinners, expensive excursions. Mike had already gone back to Preston to spend time with his brothers, and Dad, as usual, proudly announced that his son had great prospects with the team. I waited until dinner was over. Mom and Dad were still at the table, not yet buried in their phone screens. "I got into Blackwood College," I said, keeping my voice steady. Mom glanced at me, briefly looking up from scrolling through her news feed. "That's nice, sweetheart," she murmured. "Their business program is ranked among the best in the country," I added, hoping that detail might spark their interest. They exchanged a look. "I need to pay for tuition," I said evenly, feeling my heartbeat quicken. "We can use my share of grandma's inheritance." A different kind of silence settled over the room. Heavy. Suffocating. Dad took a deep breath and set his coffee mug aside. "We don't have the money for your tuition," he said flatly. I froze. "But Grandma left the money for both of us." I struggled to keep my composure. "She made you promise." In front of everyone. Mom bit her lip as if searching for something comforting to say, but in the end, she just lowered her gaze. Dad shrugged. "We spent it," he replied calmly. "On what?" My voice wavered. "Our vacation," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "The rest went to your brother," Mom added. "He needed it more." It felt like the ground beneath me shifted. But Mike is at Preston University." I burst out. "He has everything." "It was an expensive trip," Mom said matter-of-factly. "And Mike's education isn't cheap. He needs our support." "And what about me?" My voice rang through the room. Dad sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You're strong, Peyton. You'll figure it out." I stared at them, trying to process what they had just said. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in, the air thickening, the silence ringing with something dark and inevitable. "You promised her," I said, my voice trembling. Dad, without even looking at me, took another sip of coffee, slowly set his mug down on the table, and only then finally spoke. "We didn't want to upset your mother in her final days." I blinked, unable to believe what I had just heard. "What?" "We knew from the start that we weren't going to give you that money," he said evenly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Something inside me snapped. For 18 years, I had swallowed my pride, learned to be invisible, suppressed my anger, accepted their neglect as an inevitability. But now, in this very moment, all of that bottled-up pain burst free. "Liars!" I shouted, jumping up so abruptly that my chair crashed to the floor. They didn't even flinch. "You're nothing but liars who betrayed Grandma's last wish. You spent my money on a vacation. You gave it to Mike, who already got his share." My breath came in ragged gasps, as if I had just run a marathon. "You lied to her. You lied to me." I expected to see at least a flicker of remorse on their faces. Instead, Dad just shook his head, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Get out," he said coldly. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. But Mom was already rising from her seat. "You're an adult, Peyton." Her voice was icy. "If you think you're independent enough to speak to us like that, then you're independent enough to take care of yourself." I couldn't move. Before I could say anything, Mom grabbed my wrist and practically dragged me up the stairs to my room. "Since you seem to think we owe you so much," she said, yanking open my dresser drawers, "it's time for you to start living on your own." She pulled my old suitcase out from under the bed and threw it at my feet. "Pack your things. You're leaving first thing in the morning." I stood frozen, watching as she jerked the suitcase handle up. This was really happening. They were kicking me out. "Mom," I started, but then I stopped. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. There wasn't a trace of regret in her eyes, only irritation. As if I weren't her daughter, but some stranger who had overstayed their welcome. And then it hit me. I had never truly mattered to them. The people I had spent my entire life trying to please, the ones whose approval I had worked myself to exhaustion for, had never really existed. I had loved a ghost I had created in my own mind. The two people standing in front of me were nothing more than strangers who happened to share my DNA. Without a word, I started packing. Clothes, my laptop, a few books, a couple of photographs where Grandma and I were smiling into the camera. Mom stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me as if I might try to steal something valuable. As if there was anything left in that house that I could possibly want. When my suitcase was full, I pulled out my phone and quickly typed a message. "Peyton, can I come over? It's important." Jenny's reply came instantly. "Jenny, of course." The doors open. I walked out of the house without saying goodbye. No one tried to stop me. Jenny's parents had given her a small apartment for her 18th birthday. It was only a few blocks from what used to be my home. When I reached the door, she was already waiting. Her eyes flickered from my face to the suitcase, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say a word, just stepped forward and pulled me into a tight hug. That night, we sat on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, drinking hot chocolate in silence. I stared down at the cup in my hands, feeling the gaping void inside my chest slowly begin to heal. I knew what I had to do next. I accepted Evergreen State University's offer. A full scholarship and free housing would be my ticket to a new life. But I still needed money for books and daily expenses. Which meant I had to work that summer. Sunnyside Cafe was small but cozy. The air was filled with the scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries, and every day I learned something new: how to brew the perfect latte, how to take orders while balancing trays, how to smile at customers even when I was exhausted. The job was tough, but here, among the hum of the espresso machine and the cheerful voices of customers, I felt, for the first time, that I was building my life on my own. I learned what it meant to stand on my own 2 feet. Every dollar I earned at Sunnyside went straight into my savings account. Day by day, dollar by dollar, I put away money for the future. My paycheck barely covered the essentials: food, transportation, phone bills, but I learned how to stretch every penny. When fall arrived, I hugged Jenny goodbye and moved into my dorm at Evergreen State University. "Wow, you don't have much stuff," said Sarah, my new roommate, glancing at my modest belongings: a suitcase of clothes, a laptop, and a few books. I shrugged, unsure how to respond. "If you ever need to, you can use my mini fridge," she added, nodding toward a small silver appliance in the corner of the room. Simple kindness. So simple it nearly brought me to tears. I quickly found a job at the university library. In the evenings, I shelved books, worked the reference desk, helped students find materials. My time was consumed by studying, working, and studying again. There was no room for thoughts about the past. The library became my refuge. Quiet, orderly, predictable. Everything my family had never been. When relatives called, their questions felt forced, laced with barely concealed concern. "Do you have a place to stay?" Aunt Linda would ask. "Are you eating properly?" Uncle Bob wanted to know. I answered honestly, I was fine. I wondered what stories my parents had told them about me. Sometimes Jenny brought me news about my family. "Hey, I heard your brother." "I don't want to know," I'd cut her off, and she understood. The holidays could have been difficult. But Jenny's family never let me spend them alone. That first Christmas at their house, I sat at a large dining table, surrounded by warmth and genuine care. After dinner, her father, Mr. Peterson, pulled me aside. "Peyton," his voice was serious, but kind. "I've been watching how hard you work." I froze, waiting for what would come next. "When you graduate, there will be a place for you at Peterson Technologies. If you want it." I agreed immediately. My eyes burned with tears. Finally, someone had noticed my efforts. Graduation came faster than I had expected. I stood on stage, accepting my honors diploma, instinctively scanning the crowd. Jenny and her parents sat in the front rows. Their applause was so loud it drowned out the rest of the crowd. I didn't look for any other familiar faces. On my first day at Peterson Technologies, I walked into the office wearing a suit I had bought with my library savings. 6 months later, I was leading my own projects. By my second year, I had a team reporting to me. The look on Mr. Peterson's face when he reviewed my results said more than words. He hadn't been wrong to make me that offer. I threw myself into my work. I studied every detail, took on the toughest challenges. If someone said, "That's impossible," I found a way. My reputation grew. Promotions and raises followed. Soon, I was making more money than I had ever imagined back in the days when I counted my cafe tips. I bought myself professional clothes, signed up for yoga, took a vacation with Jenny to places I had only seen in magazines before. My birthdays were no longer reminders of neglect. Now, they were celebrations of achievement. Jenny hosted small gatherings with only close friends from work. Good food, genuine laughter, no tension. A life I had built on my own. The dynamics of a family, without pretense, without pain. Life moved forward, and I allowed myself to enjoy every day, every achievement, every moment that was fully and completely mine. My 27th birthday was approaching, and I had a secret I hadn't even shared with Jenny. For the past 5 years, I had been saving every extra penny. Christmas bonuses, performance awards, even money I could have spent on lunch, choosing instead to bring sandwiches from home rather than buy them from the cafe downstairs. Every dollar went into a special savings account labeled simply as "Dream." And now, the dream had become reality. 3 weeks before my birthday, I stood in an empty living room with high ceilings and massive windows. The hardwood floors gleamed in the midday sunlight. I signed the papers that made this place mine. Congratulations, the realtor said, handing me the keys. It's all yours now. I nodded, gripping the cold metal in my palm. My own apartment. Not rented. Mine. That evening, feeling a little bolder than usual, and maybe a little proud, I did something I rarely did. I posted on social media. Just a simple photo, me standing in my empty but beautiful living room, keys dangling from my fingers. The caption: an early gift to myself. Dreams come true when you work hard enough. The likes and comments flooded in immediately. Jenny, of course, was the first. Finally. I can't wait for the housewarming. Colleagues from Peterson Technologies chimed in with their congratulations. Even a few relatives I hadn't heard from in years liked the post and left comments like, "So proud of you," and "Happy early birthday." I just smirked. A week later, as I sat at my desk at work, reviewing quarterly reports, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. But I recognized it instantly. My mother. I let it ring a few times before finally pressing the green button. Her voice poured through the speaker, sweet as honey, and just as sticky. "Peyton, darling," she exclaimed, with a delight I had never once heard directed at me. "I saw your beautiful new apartment on Facebook, and it suddenly hit me, your birthday is coming up." Suddenly hit her. After all these years of forgetting. "It's so wonderful to see you doing so well," she continued. I stayed silent, letting her talk. "Your father and I thought that this year, we should celebrate your birthday properly, at home. We'll invite the whole family, make it a special event." I nearly laughed out loud. Years of silence. And now that I had a beautiful apartment, I was suddenly worth remembering. Worth celebrating. "We've missed you so much," she added, and I could almost picture her carefully rehearsed look of concern. She was pretending. Just like always. "It's time for the family to come together again. What do you say?" I should have said no. Should have thrown the truth in her face. But instead, I heard my own voice say, "Of course, Mom. Why not?" I hung up. And only then did I feel my smile slowly stretch across my face. There was no warmth in it. After all these years, I was curious, what game were they playing? I pulled up to my parents' house in my new Mercedes, the engine purring softly, like a predator patiently waiting. The contrast between my car and the house was striking. The peeling paint, darkened in places with age, the missing shingles, the overgrown lawn, everything about it looked tired, stuck in time, as if no one had cared for it in years. As soon as I turned off the engine, Mom and Dad appeared in the doorway. Their eyes weren't on me. They were on the car. First, shock. Then, a quick assessment. I stepped out slowly, my posture straight. I was wearing a designer suit, perfectly tailored, and heels that clicked confidently against the cracked asphalt of the walkway. I saw the shift in their expressions, the way their eyes lit up with calculation. Mom was the first to rush toward me. "Peyton," she exclaimed, wrapping me in a surprisingly firm embrace. Her enthusiasm was so unexpected that I nearly took a step back. "You look," she pulled away, scanning me from head to toe. "Expensive." Dad stood a few feet behind her, hands clasped behind his back, trying to appear casual but failing. They both looked older than I remembered. More gray hair, deeper wrinkles, slouched shoulders. I stepped inside. It was worse than the outside. The furniture from my childhood was worn and faded, the once plush carpet now looked threadbare, as if it had been walked over until nothing remained. And on the couch, as if he had never left it, was Mike. I barely recognized him. He had gained weight, his face had softened, and a receding hairline was already visible. Next to him sat a young woman with gentle features, her pregnant belly rounding noticeably under her dress. "Hey, sis," Mike said lazily, not bothering to get up. "Meet Sarah, my wife." Mom jumped in before I could say anything. "He's just staying with us temporarily. I didn't ask for this," she said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. "College wasn't exactly the right fit for him," Dad added, shaking his head. "But he's got promising job prospects." 9 years of promising job prospects. I said nothing, keeping my expression neutral. "The guests will be here soon," Dad added, gesturing to the table, piled high with food. "But first, tell us about your job. That's your car outside, right? You must be making good money." "Everything's fine," I replied smoothly, sidestepping the question. "The catering looks nice," I added, deliberately steering the conversation away. "But what exactly do you do?" Mom pressed. "Your apartment must have cost a fortune. And the Mercedes." I smiled politely. "I work in management." Before they could dig any further, the doorbell rang. The house filled with relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in nearly a decade now surrounded me, hugging me, gushing, smiling like we had always been close. "Aunt Helen, sweetheart." I heard a familiar voice, then felt her pulling me aside. "I'm so glad you finally came to your senses," she whispered, her lips trembling with barely contained excitement. I froze. "Your parents were so worried," she continued. "It must have been so hard for you after everything." I had no idea what she was talking about. "After you ran away with that homeless man who refused to work." She patted my shoulder, clearly believing I was familiar with this version of events. I barely stopped myself from laughing. "But just look at you now," she added, beaming. "Clean, respectable. Everything is back in order." Back in order. I had built my career, worked, earned promotions, bought a home, while my parents spun stories about their disgraced runaway daughter. In their version, they were the heartbroken parents left behind, and I was the reckless girl who had thrown her life away for some deadbeat. And now that I had returned, successful, polished, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. I had played right into their hands when I cut ties with the extended family after leaving home. It gave them the freedom to tell whatever story they wanted. When everyone had taken their seats at the table, my father stood and raised his glass. "We're gathered here today to celebrate our wonderful daughter," he announced, his voice ringing with forced emotion. I blinked. "We're so proud of the woman she's become." Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I watched her, and a vague, almost forgotten memory stirred within me. I had seen this before, the same calculated pauses, the same carefully measured display of emotion. Her voice trembled in just the right places, her hands shook ever so slightly, her eyes glistened as if on the verge of tears. "Families should always stick together," she said, reaching across the table toward me. I didn't move. My hands remained tightly clasped in my lap, as if that was the only thing keeping me from letting all the emotions inside me spill over. "That's what matters most, a family that supports one another." Her voice was soft, deliberately warm, but the quick flicker of her eyes toward my expensive watch and jewelry betrayed her true intentions. "Your father and I," she sniffled, lowering her gaze. "We always knew you were special, that you would achieve anything you set your mind to." I let the silence stretch between us, allowing her words to hang in the heavy air. Then, slowly, I stood, smoothed the hem of my dress, and looked around the room. "Thank you all for coming," I said calmly, clearly, without hesitation. Funny how my parents suddenly remembered my birthday this year. The room froze. Mom's fake tears vanished in an instant. "You know, growing up, they never celebrated my birthdays. Not once." I smiled, but there was no joy in it. But apparently, a nice apartment in a good part of town and a Mercedes make birthdays more memorable, don't they? Dad tensed, gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Peyton, this isn't the time. No, this is exactly the time. I turned to the guests, scanning the faces of my relatives. Aunt Helen told me something interesting today. Mom stiffened, her fingers curling into fists. Apparently, I ran away from home at 18 with some guy, became homeless, and refused to work. I let out a short, humorless laugh, crossing my arms. Honestly, I'd love to hear more about this mysterious bad boy I supposedly ran off with. Mom let out a nervous laugh, but it was strained, unnatural. Sweetheart, let's not dredge up the past. You mean let's not dredge up the truth? I cut her off, raising my voice. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mike, who had been silent the entire time, stared down at his plate. Let's talk about how I was thrown out of the house the day after I graduated high school. Aunt Helen's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Want to know why? I let the question hang in the air before continuing. Because I reminded them of the promise they made to Grandma. The one where they swore to use her inheritance for both Mike and me to go to college. I locked eyes with my father. Remember, Dad? You made that promise in front of everyone. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. But instead, they spent my share on a luxury vacation. And the rest? They gave it to Mike. Mom opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance. And when I had the audacity to ask about it, they kicked me out. That's not true, Mom murmured weakly, but I could already see the realization dawning in my relatives' eyes. Aunt Helen looked at my parents with open disgust. Uncle Bob shook his head, brows furrowed. Mike lowered his head further, as if hoping he could simply disappear. I put myself through college. Built my career from nothing. And in 9 years, they never called me. Never once remembered my birthday. I let a pause stretch before delivering the final blow. Until they saw my new apartment on Facebook. Silence fell over the room, thick and impenetrable as concrete. I picked up my purse and, before leaving, said, "Sorry to interrupt this lovely party, but I thought you all deserved to hear the truth." I glanced around the room, taking in their faces, confused, guilty, angry. I didn't come back for reconciliation. I looked directly at my parents. I came back to set the record straight. The drive home felt like liberation. I stepped into my apartment and felt the tension that had gripped me all evening finally dissolve. Here, in my own space, surrounded by things I had chosen for myself, I was free. Dinner was already waiting on the table, still warm. I knew exactly how this night would end. Jenny and her boyfriend arrived first. Then my colleagues. My real friends. We ate, drank, laughed, celebrating not just my birthday but my freedom. Freedom from their lies. Freedom from the past. The messages started coming in that night. Mom, please, Peyton, reconsider. Dad, we were wrong. Mike, sis, I need help. It's just temporary. I blocked their numbers one by one. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.